Hey, it's Lou and welcome back to Shade Shorts on Film. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to talk about listener support. Shade is an independent show, a valuable archive of conversations with Black art practitioners created for reference, research, and your enjoyment. Your support is super important to this work continuing, so if you're able to show the love for this show and pay it forward so it stays free for all listeners, please go to either the Patreon or PayPal donation link in the podcast description. The aim is to keep this rich archive free of charge, which is really important. So thank you so much for listening. Okay, let's go to the conversation. Today my guest is the photographer and filmmaker Jermaine Francis. His practice works within documentary and portraiture in the format of personal-driven photo projects and editorials, exploring the issues that arise from our interaction in the everyday environment. He's published 2 books, Something That Seems So Familiar in 2020, and in 2021, Rhythms from the Metroplex, and he's currently working on a new book with the publishers Here Press. His work can be found in publications such as ID, 10 Magazine and the Wall Street Journal, and Jermaine has exhibited his work at the Gallery PCP in Paris, Photo London and Saatchi, just to name a few. And today Jermaine and I discuss his recent film, Lost in Music, a post-industrial dreamscape, an exploration of race and politics within a dance floor context. I really loved talking with Jermaine. Our conversation on and off air was super enriching, and I hope that you enjoy his words on race, class, politics, and his rich creative life as much as I did. We went a little over time because, well, I could have talked to Jermaine all day. But here we go. Here's the edited version. Enjoy my chat with Jermaine Francis. For this piece, you presented a documentary-style vision of the post-industrial Black experience, the kind of focus on hyper-productivity. I was getting the feeling of, bodies as capital generating tools, political tools, which is completely at odds with the thriving dancing embodiment of our community. And it was almost as if the messaging put on our being is at odds with what we're kind of searching for or living for on the dance floor. But it was really powerful. Can you talk us through the work, the ideas that you were exploring, and specifically the audio presented alongside as part of the film? Or we'll go on to the visuals later.
Yeah, I mean, those readings are there in the work. I mean, the work isn't a didactic piece of work, so I've deliberately made it, but it's layered, and that you have, that those readings you have are correct. It's also about class.
Mm.
Natalie Ola gave a really good description of it when she wrote to me, and she said it was like a scrap heap format of. It's like you're going for a sense of wading through the ruins of a visually saturated culture,
Yeah.
which can never be deciphered from vested interest. And we formulate, and we're also formulated by the spectacle, and we can only and it's this fleeting world beyond it, and we see glimpses, and the past informing the present. um and what was interesting, she said, like, where there was actually a place where actual politics once took place. So it is
Mm.
dealing with what you've said. These things are things, and around that idea of, like you said, the dance floor itself, and maybe hedonism, or all those things. It's also a sense of, there's a lot of hauntology in there, and people don't know what hauntology is. It comes from Derrida's sort of play on the word ontology.
Mm.
And it's had a lot of hauntology reared its head a lot because of Mark Fisher, and who was a goldsmiths, and was a lecturer, writer, thinker, who died years ago. And what I took from the hauntology when reading Derrida's, because it comes from Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, was when he talks about it's not the ghost, it's the spirits of the ghost that basically haunt Marx in his critique of it, and it is this conversation about Marx. And I thought about that as well, and what Fisher was saying, and I was thinking in my own sort of relationship, in the sense of, in terms of, let's say, for example, politics, post-industrialism, which is where we're at, basically. All those things have come from that, but also the policies and the ideologies, these ideas that are constantly being brought and resurfaced. I like these guys from past, like, for example, Rivers of Blood by Enoch Powell. I come from the West Midlands, and Enoch Powell, I think, like, it's not the ghost of Enoch Powell that haunts us, it's the spirits of that Rivers of Blood speech,
Mm.
which you can see echoed in politics on the use of immigration, of nationalism, of national identity, and who belongs, who truly belong, and what that representation means. And then, in a sense of post-industrialism, in a sense of like what happened and where we're at, and the death of industry, and that loss in some ways of working class kind of direct sort of influence and power, and an insecurity in the future, all those things, they're all interrelated, and they're not separate. And in terms of, intersectionality, so there was also the sense of, like, it's almost like a dream. So, like, the policies of that, I guess, like Thatcher is with the Tory party's hauntology, the spirit of Thatcher haunts this country, as well as politics, as much as anything else, especially in recent years. You can see it. So it's supposed to be quite a layered and complicated visual piece, but it's
Mm.
not giving you a simple. It's like a conduit for a dialogue that's dialectical, if that's
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. It's the kind of piece that reverberates like within your body as you're watching it. And I just thought that that was really interesting. So it's these big ideas, but it was very intimate um, in its impact. I just wondered how the process was for you personally.
Well, I mean, all my work is interested in, even, I work with a photography, or maybe people say lens-based medium. I'm always interested in the image, but one of the things I've always been interested in is, this idea, the idea of the sublime, and the idea of the sublime does come from a certain kind of position, Kant and Burke and people like that, which is very much negates gender and race and class politics in order to get to a sensation. And I've always thought about image. So the image is a work that's always affected me, has always been about something that's sensory. And what I wanted to do is, I'm always thinking about the psychological aspects of race. We always see the physical aspects very much so presented to us. But for me, it's about, or there's also the psychological. So it's like the sense of negotiating your space, or
Mm,
walking into a shop and you may well be followed, and how that psychologically affects you. So, I'm very much interested in that sense of the sensory, and the sound, and the soundtrack was playing on the sounds and the hypnotic rhythms that you had on the dance floor, or over a particular dance floor,
mm,
but also, it reflects to kind of like science fiction, Afrofuturism, and those things, like, with Lee Scratch Perry and the Ark, and dub, and and spatial oscillation, and how that can, the idea, in order to, like with Drexian, the idea of sort of being able to step out into an alternative space in order to try and make a comment, or create a dialogue or critique. And I wanted that to do that. I wanted it to be slightly uncomfortable. I wanted it to be jarring and slightly kind of disruptive, because I think the periods we're living in, especially at the moment, are like that. With the internet and information and scrolling, we have as Natalie said, it's like this wasteland of information. And we can't quite sometimes grasp it properly. I feel like we're searching for it. I was thinking about this idea. It feels like I'm living in a dream sometimes.
Mm,
I'm being told, everyone's being told that they're going to have social mobility. They're all being told that the future is bright and you can have, and when in reality, we're going through a period where the generations before us had it better. Our parents had it better. That idea that is going to some extent in neoliberal terms. That's what we've been living in. And then in terms of race, I wanted to have this kind of idea of layering and talking about history and about what's gone on. From also from a personal point of view, and I grew up in a West Midlands, very working class area. It's multicultural place. I grew up in a black country, which was very much more white working class, with a lot of Southern Asian and if you black families. And I was talking about this idea of belonging and legacy and um and when you look at politics and when you look at there's a really amazing archive footage of Michael Manley, the former Jamaican prime minister,
mm,
talking about Britain in the 60s, late 60s, and he was saying that things are, that there are always problems, there's always issues, but it's when politicians use language to present, this position when their policies are under threat or their policies aren't working, then you see this real explosion. And so, and it's the same thing Stuart Hall's talking about, when you're talking about representation or representation, you know, you have this kind of, production of meaning or symbolic activity. And like, what you said, Lou, before, you saw this thing as the body as a form of production and capital, in the sense of the dance floor and our
mm,
bodies, and also what we're doing and feeling, but the reality outside and what goes on the dance floor. And, I was thinking about that sense of hedonism, and especially in the late 80s and 90s of, acid house and rave, where there was this kind of period of utopiast kind of ideas of maybe we just didn't want to have how it was before. But then what was the political reality after that? Um, and so, it's trying to sort of kind of, I don't know the word for it, take us on a journey through that to some extent and some of those ideas. And I think work is really about, or artwork or film, visual imagery is about, in some ways, creating a discussion and a dialogue. I don't think it can give the answers, and I'm not sure it can really change the world in that kind of utopian humanist sense. But I think it can lead to a discussion, and I think that's what the work was really always trying to do, and use aesthetics as well, which I think for me is always interesting. And the sublime is something that I think about a lot. The idea of a sensation, of a feeling, and what is that for a person who is of a minority, and that could be, race or gender and class as well. Because we that seems to be the elephant in the room. The minorities in this country make up a large amount of the working class demographic. What does that feel like, that sensation, and that's why there are those shifts in sound, in music, and playing with that thing, and melodies and things like that.
mm. And you mentioned the conversation that kind of is created from pieces like this, and you recently presented "Lost in Music" at the Camden Art Centre as part of a conversation. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Who you had there to present the piece with you, and how the ideas in their work met yours as you were presenting the piece?
Natalie Ola and Eddie, who I'd been having these conversations with anyway. I first met Natalie. I first discovered Natalie's writing, and I thought her writing was really brilliant and really interesting in terms of talking about class in a very, very multi-layered, nuanced way. Um, and the way that she could piece things together, which I could basically connect with. And Natalie had written a piece to accompany a story I did for ID magazine a few years ago, and it was a brilliant piece that she wrote, and it was a sort of a reflection of and talking about race and identity and nationalism and who belongs, and those demons which had always been there and definitely reared their heads during Brexit. And Eddie, and I had talked about similar things, and we talked about growing up in Britain and race and class demographics. And also, he's a brilliant photographer and he's also a brilliant curator. So it was great to have these conversations, and also Eddie had been involved with drum and bass and music, and so we talked about dub. And I remember reading Coda Ession's More Brilliant Than the Sun, Adventures in Sonic Fiction, and thinking about all these ideas. So I thought they'd be perfect people to bring together to have a conversation about ideas around the film and ideas we've been thinking about. Natalie and I have a connection. We're both from the West Midlands. Family members and of ours and generations had worked at sort of Leyland or GM Motors. That disappeared, and how you know, obviously her family will be sort of white, mine will be black, Afro-Caribbean, Jamaican in descent. But those same economic disruptions or issues that happen when you lose an industry from an area, they would affect us both. And the reason, I brought that up is because in political terms and in media terms, working class is talked about very much for a white indigenous position, when the working classes are a accumulation of different groups economically.
Mm.
And so it's an interesting thing to think about Fred Hampton, the way he talks about, working with race and class and political issues. There will be those issues involved in employment, housing, but obviously race comes into it, and then how that is used politically to um, for nefarious means, and how then race affects the minorities and the demographics in those working class areas. And so, that was really interesting to intersect and have those conversations also with Eddie as well, with the same conversations. So I thought it was a really good way of creating a rich dialogue from this film with the audience as well. And the audience participated. We talked about all of those things. So for me, it was a really great way of how imagery can then lead to some kind of conversation in a space. And that space, maybe, in some ways, you may be speaking to the converted as well, which also is a problem.
Yeah.
Be speaking to a wider demographic. So, yeah, that's how Natalie and Eddie came to be in this conversation, in this talk. But Eddie and Natalie are in this conversation anyway because it's about them as well.
And I was like thinking about the visual impact of the piece, and this is not a comparison in by any stretch of the imagination, but my thoughts when I was seeing some of the images went straight to Mark Leckey, Fiorucci Made Me Hardcore, and its resonance. It's just like it's just very impactful. And your piece reminded me of 90s rave visuals. These were the visuals that when we were there in Fields Intense, these were the similar kind of visuals or of a similar sentiment that were playing as we were at the raves. That
Mm.
was what was shown behind the DJ. And so all of that was kind of going through my consciousness as I was viewing your piece. And that was Thatcher time and post Thatcher time. And me and my peers were questioning our positioning as, these seemingly free living, loving humans, but it was at a time of increasing political disintegration, tech and industrialism, where we didn't really know where it was going to take us. And looking at your piece has kind of made me think back, but then again forward and think, God, well, this is where it has taken us. And so that was a very interesting kind of timeline process that I went through when I was watching it. And I love that when I was thinking of this, and then there was a smiley face like that came up at the end of your film. I was like, I can't believe it.
Very distorted smiley face with blood running
Distorted.
down it next with a really ominous sound. I think, yeah, I mean, look, I have no problems with that reference point of Mark Leckey because we all saw Fiorucci's Hardcore, and it's a great piece of work. And I think Jeremy Deller's documentary was really great because what I think, Mark with that piece of work, I think is brilliant. For me, that's like sublime. As if you talk about the sublime, I think that definitely has that quality in there.
Mm,
And Jake Medella's sort of document, piece was amazing because what he did was he showed the political and social and cultural aspects behind a lot of that, what happened and why it happened, and it's like a history of Britain, and
mm,
where like he said about um I think it's Greg Wilson. DJ talked about, well, black kids were dancing to house music in the early '80s
yeah,
before that period of time, which is called that acid house,
yeah,
summer of love, and talking about Detroit. And I always loved Detroit techno, and I always had a weird affiliation to it, not affiliation, a weird connection to it because Birmingham was the Motor City as well,
yes,
and that has died in much later years. So I understood about the car, and a car, a sense of having transportation, and also there was these things I've been thinking about the canal. Where I grew up were a lot of canals, and they were the main transportation points, and then they died, and it
yeah,
went to rail and motorways. And so I think also there's a thing also that I have is like, although I'm from that period of going out, and there is nostalgia, but I also think there's also a slight bit of cynicism as well. But I have to having that nostalgia because I think melancholy is an interesting idea and concept, and I think melancholy, especially English melancholy, has been a problem in the sense of that's what Britain has veered back to, in a sense
mm,
of trying to attain this greatness of power, but this loss of power, and that is a melancholy.
mm,
So I think about that a lot in terms of what does that mean, and how can that affect things, you know, Ghosts of My Life, Mark Fisher's book, Writings on Depression, Hauntology, Lost Futures. There's great essays about, right, this it was quite funny. It did remind me of like this nostalgia of old ravers going to places where they used to rave, and like, oh, how good it used to be, and whatever, and
yeah,
that's why I bring up those things. But it's also a really interesting thing that Della talks about it, and it is an interesting point. You have post-industrialism, you have the loss of factories, and you have warehouses, and those places were a site of production. And what happens is then you have these spaces then taken over by um, ravers, DJs, and parties appear. Then what happens is that you have this kind of sense of regeneration or creativity in those spaces. But then those, dance music and those things now become another form of
mm,
production, and they've become entertainment.
mm,
What I think is also interesting and they become like a commodity.
mm,
The Joe Smooth and the Style Council clip, um, Promised Land. I
yeah,
remember a lot of people not knowing the Joe Smooth version and knowing the Style Council version, how that was amplified. And, they've replicated the imagery of like gospel and, all that kind of thing. But it came from Chicago, from Joe Smooth, the original version.
mm,
And it was interesting to talk about those politics of music as well, and capital of music, how some people argue about, black culture not being acknowledged in its influence on certain or an absence, probably is the word I'd use, an absence. So I thought that was interesting as well in those terms. But also those spaces which were clubs or warehouses have now become the ultimate assets and commodity, which is housing, real estate. So the hacienda became apartments. Um, Printworks is going to become apartments.
Mm.
Printworks was I think it was the printing press. I can't remember, for the Evening Standard, something like. But that was a site of production, you know, industrial production, old way of production. Then it became, a disused warehouse. Then it's become like a place of entertainment and parties and clubbing, another commodity. And it also uses those myths of the past, which were associated when the early party goers or ravers or people going out to acid house parties, they use that sense of freedom and mythology and imagery to sell those spaces now. And even, it was funny, we were talking to some people from Manchester. The history and the imagery of the Hacienda Club is used as a part of branding to sell the clubs themselves,
Yeah,
sell the apartments themselves, the
yeah,
housing themselves. So
yeah,
it's sort of looking at that kind of thing, and housing is a massive thing in politics. When you listen to politicians when they're selling their manifestos, you're guaranteed housing is going to be in there. And we heard Keir Starmer doing it the other day. Funny enough, talking about Tories are not the party of housing, of building housing. We need new housing and social mobility with housing and cheaper. But we're gonna build on greenbelt land.
mm,
Now, yes, I understand that, but you can see there's a political rhetoric going on. You're going to build on greenbelt land, but some of that greenbelt land, you're saying you've got a kind of manifesto that's also looking at um, eco and conservation and climate. So you can see the power of house building as a symbol of political rhetoric or a symbol of sort of social mobility and capitalism. To own your own house, especially if you're working class, is it's a massive thing. My mother appears in the film. She's the nurse, um, and she appears next to the. She appears in two parts. She appears as the young immigrant
mm.
girl with her sister, my auntie, and she appears as the nurse. The NHS is a really big another symbol of political kind of strategy and rhetoric.
Mhm.
Um, but without my mother's generation of migrant or immigrant nurses, the NHS would have fell.
Say my father, his first job was, yeah, NHS when he, yeah, came over from Ghana, and my mind was just going to what you were saying about Joe Smooth and Style Council. I must have been living under a rock. I had no idea that Style Council even did a version of Promised Land.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was big.
I had I don't know what I was listening to then, but I only know the Joe Smooth version, and that was what was played at the end of every night, and I just
That was
feel like, yeah, that was just
bonkers. Yeah, but the mainstream popular version, with a lot of, was on Top of the Pops, was Style Council.
okay. I'm gonna go and listen to that. Obviously, that was just blanked out of my consciousness because I was not taking it in. I had no idea. Now, this chat's been about film because this is the film series, but I know your photography work pretty well. You're a documentary portrait photographer, personal driven photo projects and editorials for the likes of ID, like you mentioned earlier, 10 magazine. You've been published in the Wall Street Journal, and you have commercial clients too. Um, but I'd love to sort of round up by hearing about where your head is at now in terms of your image making, where your head's at in terms of the influences are coming in, what's inspiring you, or where you are in your rich creative life at the moment. And then I also want to round up by just thinking about how young Jermaine would look at what you're creating now, where you're creating, and how you're creating.
Well, I mean, I sit in many different camps, and one of the sometimes I lecture at Royal College of Art on the architecture course in media studies, and David Burns, who's the head of the course, and I think is a really really interesting man. Talked about ideas of distribution. It's true. What I look at when I make work are spaces of distribution. So whether
Mm,
it's a magazine, whether it's a book, whether it's a gallery, exhibitions I'm doing, they are different or the film, there are different spaces of distribution. You know, when I make an editorial and I'm lucky with ID that I get to explore, that Alistair allows me to have the space or gives me the space to explore, you know, like Lost in Music came from originally from thoughts I was having, but also from a project I did in ID.
Mm.
Um, but then, you know, I also have like, you know, I was allowed to make a project as well by KK Obiet for Boy Brother Friend, which is a really, really interesting magazine about the death of the Queen. Um, but then, you know, I'll make a book, or, you know, I'm exhibiting a lot at the moment. I just finished a work at Oxford, and I had a show in Paris end of last year, and I'm going to be showing at the Saatchi and the Centre of British Photography. And Lost in Music, Post-Industrial Dreamscape, will be a show with the gallery that I have in Paris, Gallery PCP, at the end of the year. Um, so, you know, I'm always, you know, at the moment, I've always thought about space. And I mean that in the terms of physical and psychological, and how we negotiate that and how we work within that. Um, and so, you know, the latest work I've been working on has been about the absence of the black figure in the pastoral landscape, which is something
Mm.
I always thought about. And it was one of my main interrogations when I was at Derby University, where I studied photography back in the 90s. The work's always had a political undertone because I think it may not be overt at times. It may be just about the aesthetics, might be whatever. But there's always things there, and like I made an exhibition which was called A Storied Ground,
Mm.
which is sort of refers to Paul Redman's book about how Britain's national identity is created. And it was about the black figure in the landscape, and it was also about black identity and people who were black who would class themselves as alternative and what that can mean. And I'm always against trying to present cultures as monocultures. Nationalism does that. It likes to
Mm.
present groups of people or identities as mono, especially in the arts and sometimes like that. Aesthetics get picked, which present black identity is very simplistic, or very mono. The Sweet Fly Paper of Life by Langston Hughes and Roy de Carava is an interesting book because in some ways I think it's what a lot is missed in that book, but Langston is saying that black people can be bad as well. But we're not all bad, but we can be bad. There are bad people, and that is fine because we are human and we should be allowed to have that right. And we should be have that right like everybody else is allowed without being demonized as a race. Um, as the same as, you know, James Baldwin talks about I'm not your Negro, like, you know, the complications that he has being a black homosexual man, and what he's fighting for in terms of race may not align with Martin Luther King's group in some ways about moral Christian values, or, you know, Nation of Islam and the way that they look at it. That's what I'm saying, you know, things aren't simple and complicated. And, you know, I wanted to do that with A Storied Ground and a new work which I've worked with Oxford Pembroke College, JCR, part of the Oxford Photo Festival. A Pleasant Land is it's about the absence of black figures, not just in landscape but in history,
Mm.
metaphorically, and, you know, but also figures that may have been people don't know about, who were against national, you know, colonialism and slavery, and this absence of the black thing, the pastoral, which is really late. You know, the pastoral is like one of the last bastions that you could say of English nationalism, in a way that it presents Britain, the pleasant land, and a wash away from politics. And the sublime is a lot to do with that as well. You know, it does remove the idea of gender and race and class in order to get to a point of a kind of narrow, a pure beauty or particular aesthetic. So, you know, those things have always interested me, those things of where I am at in the way I make work and visual things. And I just co-curated a show with Emma Balkett for Peckham 24. Emma asked, and Viv, with I it was about body language, and they asked, would you make a show about the black male body? And that was the same approach that I took, you know, And the Stuart Hall essay, Ethnicities, was a really great framework to work from, to think about those things and about, instead of having something that was literal and didactic, to talk about the psychological and have not the body as, like you said in Lost in Music, the same thing. The body is a kind of like framework, but not the center of. It's a part of something.
Mm.
Hence why I had, and in the end we talked about the Black Atlantic and the American, the not American, sorry, the United States Black experience and the British Black experience, and trying to talk about joy, trauma, you know, pain, love. Carter Small, for example, PJ Love, about, queer love,
Yeah.
but queer love as, and in relationships terms, not placed as some fetishized sexual kind of
Yeah.
thing a lot of time, but relationships and intimacy, and
Mm.
Andrew Jackson's work on Handsworth and class and economics, to like Kian's Black Urban Cowboys. It's a beautiful piece of work, really, really, really beautiful and tender, and plays with that idea of the iconography, the American dream, the landscape. And then Ryan Prince's beautiful work about, 100 days in therapy, and about that's positive. And, a lot of people, men, and especially, and black men, you know, breaking that kind of hyper masculinity that's been placed on the male figure, or
Mm.
Armani really, it's a parallel road. And it was
Mm.
just really great, Dexter McLean, about disability, the absence of, when we talk about race, we don't talk about disability. It's not
Exactly.
included. And then Carl Lahiri's brilliant work, I thought, and George Dyer's Muffa, both, they're taking a much more didactic thing about the body, but George's beautiful piece that's about the layers and fracturing, and it's celebrating the characteristics that have been demonized and brushed away, and Carl's brilliant sort of, and humor, in that pain we have a lot of humor and laughter. And, Carl Lahiri's brilliant piece, which was a it's a pastiche, and it's of the Mapplethorpe image of the
Oh
key,
yes, yes.
and it's titled Me with a Black Burnt Banana.
Yeah.
Like, it's like Dada, and it's brilliant in art aesthetic terms as well, but
Yeah.
but hilarious, because it is ridiculous
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the stereotype. And then John Henry's Stranger Fruits, which is tragic, and it's about the fear of something that could possibly happen.
That's so important because quite often when we talk about the Black experience or the positioning of our bodies within society, it's either with the focus on the cliche of exceptionalism,
Mm.
right, or trauma. It's just two extremes, and
Yeah.
those nuances are quite often ignored. I want you to let the listeners know where they are able to view Lost in Music before we head off, or where they can find some more of your work, Jermaine. You've got books, where
Um,
can they find your work?
I mean, Lost in Music, I've sort of that is going to be shown with Gallery PCP at the end of the year as part of an installation, but I will present it before that online, short, like maybe as a 24-hour thing. I just need to sit down and think about it. And when that's up, people will know. But
Right.
I've only just sort of finished it and just finished the show, but I will do that. And then I'm showing Rhythms from the Metroplex, which is a book as part of Bill Ewing's Civilization show at the Saatchi, which opens on the 2nd of June. And then A Storied Ground will appear in a group show at the Centre of British Photography, I think from the first week of June as well. So if people want to see that, they can go and see the work there. Um, some of the works online on my website, and there'll be other stuff. Oxford will probably be something. The A Pleasant Land is in. There's loads of things in projects, so they're slowly appearing. Another book as well end next year, but Just to answer that question, where would a young what was the question? What would a young Jermaine Francis be thinking if he's
Yes. About this rich creative life of communication and visual communication that you're living now. What would a young Jermaine like? How would a young Jermaine view or think of where you are and what you're doing?
I don't think he would actually have believed it.
Really?
No, I don't think I don't think he would have believed it. I think he would have thought, wow, I wish more kids could see that you could. Well, maybe if he saw how difficult it'd been, maybe he'd go, I might give that a swerve.
Yeah.
To be honest, he might have gone, well, I'm not sure about that. I think he might want to think, he might not go that route. But I think he'd probably be like, wow, he was all right in the end, wasn't it? To some extent. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's important to hold that sentiment dear, when we're going through it.
Yeah, it's important. I think he would be a bit like, yeah, you did all right in the end. It wasn't that bad.
Yeah, he did all right. He did all right. He's doing all right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jermaine. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for like asking me, to be on the podcast. I feel very lucky that, get to talk. And as loads of people know, I talk a lot. It's probably doing some service. Health checks.